The feels-like temperature in Boston is about to hit 114 degrees. That is not a number that belongs in New England. It belongs in the desert, and it is the clearest sign yet that a merging heat dome is about to drop record-threatening heat on the entire East Coast right through the 4th of July. But the heat is only half the danger. In a moment, I will show you the second half, the storms riding the edge of that same dome, and why the two together make this holiday one to take seriously. Two separate domes of high pressure are joining together over the United States right now, and the seam where they merge is going to sit over the eastern half of the country during the 4th of July weekend. A single graphic circulating online this week summed it up in 3 words: double heat dome. Two enormous ridges of hot, sinking air, one over the central and western states, and one anchored over the western Atlantic, are expanding toward each other and linking into one sprawling dome. And that dome is going to park itself over tens of millions of people at the exact moment the country heads outside to celebrate. That is the headline, and it would be a big enough story on its own, but it is only half of what is coming. The same stalled ridge that is trapping all of this heat is also acting as a racetrack for severe thunderstorms along its northern edge. Over the next several days, round after round of intense storms are going to ride that edge, carrying damaging wind, giant hail, and tornadoes across the northern tier of the country. So this is not one threat, it is two, and they are converging on the same holiday. Here is why that combination matters so much. A heat wave stresses the power grid by driving air conditioning demand through the roof. A line of severe storms, if it organizes, can take that same grid down across hundreds of miles in a single afternoon. When those two things line up in the same region, in the same window, the heat stops being merely miserable and becomes genuinely dangerous. That has happened before, on this same week of the calendar, and it killed people. We are going to walk through both halves of this, and the single physical reason they are actually the same story. A heat dome is what happens when a ridge of high pressure parks over a region and simply refuses to move. It starts with the jet stream, the fast river of air high above us that separates cold northern air from warm southern air. When the jet stream buckles into big, exaggerated waves, one of those northward bulges can stall out into a stubborn ridge of high pressure. Often it gets pinned in place by pockets of low pressure on either side, a locked configuration that meteorologists call an omega block because on a map it looks like the Greek letter omega. Underneath that ridge, the air sinks, and as air sinks, the pressure around it rises, and that compression heats it up. It is the same reason a bicycle pump gets warm in your hand. That sinking air also flattens out any clouds trying to form, so the sky stays clear and the sun hammers the ground all day long without interruption. Every clear, hot day bakes the surface a little more. The surface warms the air above it, and that reinforces the ridge. It becomes a self-feeding loop that can lock a heat dome in place for a week or longer, while the low-pressure systems on the flanks hold the whole thing in position so no normal weather pattern can break through. Now take that mechanism and double it. What is setting up over the country right now is two of these ridges, one over the central and western states, and one tied to the Bermuda High over the western Atlantic, expanding toward each other until they merge into a single dome covering the eastern half of the nation. And the seam, the place where the two domes fuse together, is exactly where the heat concentrates the most. That seam is forecast to sit right over the most heavily populated corridor in the country for the holiday. The heat is not a forecast for some distant day. It is already here. Yesterday, the feels-like temperature in Memphis climbed past 110 degrees. Across Chicago, Davenport, Detroit, and Indianapolis, heat index values were running between 100 and 105 degrees. And in Boston, of all places, the feels-like temperature was projected to reach as high as 114 degrees. These are not numbers you associate with the upper Midwest and New England. They are numbers you associate with the desert Southwest. And that is the whole point of a heat dome. It does not just make a hot region a little hotter. It picks up the kind of heat that belongs over Arizona and drops it onto cities that were never built to handle it, which is why the hottest air started out centered over the central states and is now sliding east toward the coast. And it is forecast to get worse as the dome strengthens and the hottest air shifts east toward the Interstate 95 corridor. By tomorrow, forecasters expect record-breaking heat all along the East Coast, with a long list of daily temperature records in jeopardy. The actual air temperatures, not the feels-like numbers, but the real thermometer readings, are forecast to reach the mid to upper 90s in the Northeast. Boston is going for around 97. Washington, D.C. is heading for close to 100. Harrisburg is going for 100. Nashville is expected to hit 100 as well. And once you fold in the humidity, the heat index in these areas will run well over 100 degrees. To put that in perspective, Mid to upper 90s is the kind of heat that should really only be showing up in Texas and Oklahoma at this time of year. It is not supposed to be parked over the Interstate 95 corridor. When you see those temperatures that far north and that far east, that is the fingerprint of a heat dome doing exactly what a heat dome does. And it is why this event has forecasters using words like dangerous and record-breaking instead of just hot. Here is something that sounds backwards, but is critical to understanding the danger. A temperature in the mid-90s in Boston is, in human terms, more dangerous than the same temperature in Texas. And the reason comes down to what your body is used to and what your buildings are built for. People in the South spend the entire summer acclimated to heat. Their bodies have adjusted, and nearly every home, store, and car has air conditioning built in and running. In the Northeast, and in older northern cities in general, that is not the case. A large share of the housing stock was never built with central air. Populations are not acclimated to extreme heat this early in the season, and when the temperature suddenly spikes 20 degrees above what people are used to, the human body does not have time to adapt. That is the exact situation that turns a heat wave deadly. It is not always the hottest place that suffers the most. It is the place that is least prepared for the heat it gets. There's also the humidity factor, and this is the part that makes the feels-like numbers so important. Your body cools itself by sweating, and sweat only cools you when it can evaporate. When the air is already thick with moisture, evaporation slows down, your sweat stops working, and your core temperature starts to climb no matter how much water you drink. That is why a humid 97 degrees can be more dangerous than a dry 105. The feels like temperature is trying to tell you how close your body is to losing that fight, and along the East Coast this week, it is going to be telling you it is very close. The most dangerous part of a heat wave is not the afternoon high, it is the overnight low. And this event is forecast to bring unusually warm nights right along with the record daytime heat. Under normal conditions, the temperature drops at night, and that gives everything a chance to recover. Your body cools down while you sleep. Buildings shed the heat they absorb during the day, and the power grid gets a break as air conditioners finally cycle off. But under a strong heat dome, the nights stay warm. The heat never fully releases. And when you string together several days of record highs with nights that refuse to cool down, the human body never gets its recovery window. Core temperature that climbed all afternoon does not fully reset overnight, and it starts the next day already elevated. Day after day that stacks up, and it is what pushes vulnerable people. The elderly, the sick, the very young, and anyone without air conditioning over the edge. This is why heat is the quiet killer among weather disasters. It does not tear the roof off a house or make for dramatic video, so it does not get the same attention as a tornado or a hurricane. But in a typical year, heat kills more Americans than any other weather hazard. And the warm overnight lows we are about to see are the exact mechanism that makes a heat wave lethal rather than just unpleasant. Keep that in mind every night this week, because the danger does not end when the sun goes down. When forecasters warn that this could be the most dangerous 4th of July in years, that is not just dramatic language. There's a real historical benchmark for how deadly an Independence Day heat wave can be, and it is horrifying. The single deadliest weather disaster in the recorded history of New England was a heat wave, and it began on the 4th of July, 1911. On that Independence Day, the temperature in Boston hit 104 degrees, a record for the date that still stands to this day more than a century later. Portland, Maine reached 103. Nashua, New Hampshire, and Bangor, Maine both hit 106. The heat wave lasted 11 days, and by the time it broke, it had killed at least several hundred people, with some estimates running as high as 2,000 deaths across the Northeast. In New York City alone, 158 people and roughly 600 horses died in the streets. That is the history that sits behind this holiday. An Independence Day heat wave is not a hypothetical worst case. It is a documented American catastrophe. And the reason it was so deadly is the same reason this week is dangerous. A population that was not ready, in a region that does not expect that kind of heat, got hit all at once. The technology has changed since 1911, but human physiology has not, and neither has the basic setup. A stalled ridge over a crowded, unprepared corridor on the 4th of July is exactly the pattern that wrote that grim record in the first place. Now here is where the second half of the story connects to the first, and it all comes back to that same dome of high pressure. Because while the center of the heat dome is baking under clear skies, the northern edge of it is doing something very different. It is spawning storms. The reason is the sinking air. Over the core of the dome, the air is sinking, and sinking air kills thunderstorms before they can grow, which is why the middle of a heat dome stays sunny and dry. But the northern rim of the dome is where the ridge is weakest, And it is where the jet stream and its embedded disturbances skirt along the top. Right there, the hot dome air runs into cooler air to the north, and the clockwise circulation around the high acts like a conveyor belt, shuttling clusters of storms eastward along that boundary. Meteorologists have a name for this setup. They call it the ring of fire. The storms cannot punch through the dome, so they wrap around its edge round after round after round. And that is exactly what is happening. As the dome builds and the hottest air locks in underneath it, disturbances are riding the northern edge and firing off repeated waves of severe weather across the plains, the Midwest, and eventually the Northeast. So the heat and the storms are not two separate weather stories that happen to be occurring at the same time. They are the same system. One ridge producing record heat in its core and destructive storms around its rim at the same moment, and the northern rim is where the immediate violent danger lives. Let's get specific about those storms because the severe weather threat is not a one-day event. It is a multi-day siege. Yesterday, the atmosphere was already primed, and forecasters had a level 3 of 5 enhanced risk of severe weather in place over parts of northern Iowa, Minneapolis, and central Wisconsin, with a broad slight risk stretching from north of Omaha all the way into central Michigan. The threats yesterday were severe across the board. Forecasters warned of damaging wind gusts as high as 85 miles per hour, rolling through Minneapolis and into central Wisconsin and Michigan. They warned of very large hail, with baseball-sized stones possible near Minneapolis, Sioux Falls, just north of Omaha, and near Wausau. And they warned of tornadoes, including the potential for an isolated EF2 or stronger, with the greatest tornado threat centered around Minneapolis, Rochester, and Owatonna. The damaging wind risk was mapped at a significant 30% hatched level, which is forecaster shorthand for a real chance of hurricane-force gusts, 75 miles per hour or greater, plus a 15% flash flood risk as storms trained over the same ground again and again. Forecasters singled out the upper Midwest for a significant hail threat in particular, with stones potentially topping 2 inches across, large enough to shatter windshields, dent roofs, and strip a garden down to stems in seconds. And the threat does not stop. Today, the severe risk continues in nearly the same footprint, a large zone from North Dakota into Milwaukee and western Michigan, with damaging winds up to 80 miles per hour near Sioux Falls, more very large hail, and a tornado threat that runs highest near Sioux Falls and around Milwaukee and Rockford during the evening hours. Then tomorrow, the threat balloons across a giant area, isolated to scattered severe storms stretching from Montana all the way east to Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, and Detroit. If you live anywhere along that northern tier, you are under the gun for multiple days in a row, and you need more than one way to receive a warning. Here's the scenario that ties everything together and keeps forecasters up at night. What happens when one of these edge-riding storm complexes organizes into a derecho and slams into a region that is already suffering under record heat? We do not have to guess because it has already happened almost to the week. A derecho is a widespread, long-lived windstorm produced by a fast-moving complex of thunderstorms. To earn the name, it has to carve a swath of damage more than 240 miles long, with widespread wind gusts of at least 58 miles per hour and several separate gusts of 75 miles per hour or more, all from the same system. It is essentially a wind bomb that can flatten trees and power lines across an entire multi-state corridor in a single afternoon and evening. And in June and July, these things are born on the northern edge of heat domes, in exactly the ring of fire setup we have right now. On June 29, 2012, a ring of fire derecho rolled off the top of a massive heat dome and raced roughly 700 miles from Indiana to the mid-Atlantic in about 12 hours, moving near 60 miles per hour the whole way. It produced widespread winds of 60 to 80 miles per hour with isolated gusts over 100. It killed 13 people directly, and then it knocked out power to more than 4 million customers, some of them for a full week, including about 1.2 million in the Washington, D.C. area alone. Here's the part that matters most. That storm hit during a heat wave with temperatures around 105 degrees, and the days-long blackout turned survivable heat into a deadly emergency. 34 more people died from the heat in the days after, because the air conditioning they needed to survive had no power. That is the compounding disaster. Same week of the year, same kind of dome, same collision of heat and wind, and it is the precise setup we are watching build right now. All of this collides on the 4th of July itself, and the timing could hardly be worse. The pattern is still forecast to be stormy on Saturday, on the holiday, right when tens of millions of Americans will be outdoors at parades, cookouts, beaches, and fireworks displays. The current outlook points to thunderstorms firing from Minneapolis toward Pittsburgh through the afternoon and into the evening. And there is a real chance for significant severe weather around, and just north of Kansas City, back into Wisconsin, timed with the exact hours when fireworks would be going off. So on top of the record heat, a lot of outdoor holiday plans across the middle of the country are going to be running headlong into strong to severe storms. If you are in that corridor, the smart move is to know where you're going to take shelter before the first rumble of thunder, and to keep a close eye on the sky through the evening. Fast-moving storms give you very little lead time, and a crowded fireworks field is the last place you want to be caught out when one arrives. And do not count on much of a warning from the sky itself. These storms can go from a distant line on the horizon to 50-mile-per-hour winds over a fairground in a matter of minutes, which is exactly how holiday crowds end up caught in the open. This is the two-front threat at its peak. Dangerous heat baking the core of the dome and severe storms wrapping around its edge, both landing on the single busiest outdoor day of the American summer. It is why this holiday, more than most, calls for an actual plan rather than a hope that the weather cooperates. So what happens once the holiday passes? The good news is that the locked pattern finally starts to break down after the 4th. The bad news is that what replaces it brings its own set of problems. Beyond the 4th of July, forecasters expect the ridge to flatten out and retrograde, sliding back to the west. As it does, it opens the door for a much more active and wetter pattern across the eastern half of the country. The Climate Prediction Center's outlooks for the 6 to 10-day and 8 to 14-day windows both lean toward above normal precipitation across the southern tier and the southeast. So the story shifts from heat and wind to rounds of rain and thunderstorms. And for areas that have been baking under the dome, that is a genuine relief. But there is one more thing worth watching, and forecasters are already flagging it. Both of those outlook discussions raise the possibility of surface low pressure developing along and off the southeast coast. Ensemble guidance shows something in the range of a 10 to 30% chance of a tropical depression forming off the southeast coast around the 9th and 10th of July, with a second signal showing up closer to the middle of the month. It is far too early to say anything definitive about that, and a 10 to 30% chance is a flag, not a forecast. But it tells you the atmosphere is loading up with moisture and energy behind this heat dome, and the tropics are the next thing on the radar once the holiday threat clears. Let's bring it all back to what actually matters over the next several days. This is one weather system with two faces, and both of them are dangerous. A merging heat dome is going to drive record-threatening heat across the core of the country and the entire East Coast, with the most dangerous conditions arriving tomorrow and holding through the holiday. And the northern edge of that same dome is firing multiple days of destructive, severe weather, with a real chance that one of those complexes organizes into a grid-threatening derecho at the worst possible moment. So here is what to watch. Watch for daily heat records to fall along the Interstate 95 corridor tomorrow and into the weekend. Watch those warm overnight lows, because they are the part that turns heat deadly. Watch the northern tier for severe storms every single day through the 4th, and if you are anywhere from the plains to the northeast, make sure you have more than one way to get a warning, because these storms are fast. And watch the grid, because the nightmare scenario, the one that already came true in 2012, is a wind event knocking out power while the heat is at its peak. Stay hydrated, check on the people around you who are most at risk, and have a plan before you head out for the holiday. We will be tracking every piece of this as it develops, and we will know a lot more about the heat records and the storm threat over the next 24 hours. This is a story that is still being written, and it is one you want to stay ahead of.